Howdy y'all. This is Kyle Whittington, and I know we try to start these off with a little more upbeat, but a little bit of a sad news. As a lot of you are probably aware, Ben Straight, the closet Catholic, his son Ezra was in the hospital, and yesterday he did pass away. But I've had a few people reach out to me asking if Ezra had received his sacraments, and I can confirm to you that Ezra was both baptized and confirmed. So there's a new saint in heaven. So and our faith tells us that we can be 100% confident on that. And so yeah. But anyway, because of that, and I don't have the link in the description right now, and I'll add it later, but. I increased the goal on the GoFundMe to help pay for funeral expenses. So if you are so inclined to give financially, that's always very much appreciated. But most importantly, please keep the family in your prayers. I'm not going to say any more on that. So with all that being said, I'm going to bring Joe on. So Joe, thank you so much for joining. Yeah. So, all right. So, let's just jump right into it. Why don't I imagine a lot of people are familiar with you from your work on Catholic Answers. I think I've seen you on like the news before, like whenever it was like the whole like invalid baptism scandal came about.
I'm surprised you saw that, but yes, I was on the news for that.
Yeah. So I guess
not
like
because I was invalidly baptized or invalidly baptizing anyone. Just to be clear, they were trying to figure out why the church cares whether you say I baptize or we baptize. So I was on to provide a little help for that.
Yeah, no, like, and I the reason why I remember that because I stole your line on that, and I've like repeated it several times of like the church doesn't determine grace, the church determines validity, and it's just like, yeah. And
I don't remember saying it, so I'm glad it was.
yeah. Okay. Well, there you go.
Sometimes there's lines that they're for other people, and I think God uses me, and not just me, everybody.
Oh yeah,
to be open to this, and it's just like, oh yeah, I like that line. I'm gonna steal that from myself. So,
well, it's amazing. Like sometimes, like you hear lines from kids, and there was when we're talking about the hypostatic union. And we're trying to explain this to kids, and this one like upstart young kid just popped up. It's like, okay, so Jesus is two whats but one who.
Boom. Yeah. My favorite explanation of the Eucharist, one of my favorite explanations of the Eucharist, comes from a kid who was being interviewed by the priest to receive First Communion, and he was trying to figure out what she knew about the Eucharist, and she points to the crucifix and says that looks like Jesus but isn't. The Eucharist doesn't look like Jesus, but is. And I was like, oh, yeah.
Nice.
I can't do better than that.
Yeah.
So, yeah, it really is one of those things where God uses everybody. Balaam's ass, little children, all of us,
Yeah.
We'll speak through whoever he wants.
Yeah. No, it's... I've heard that. I think it was like Peter Kraft or something like that. Like God rode into Jerusalem on the back of an ass just to show us that, like, he can definitely make use of us.
Exactly.
So yeah, well, that's cool. So I kind of mentioned it in the green room before we got started, but I read on your website you used to be a litigator in DC. How did that happen?
Yeah. I wanted to be a lawyer from the time I was in 7th grade. I'd been homeschooled for a while, went into St. Elizabeth's parochial school in 7th grade, and a lot of my classmates had known each other since kindergarten, and so it was hard to kind of find my niche. And once we had like mock trial, and I got to be the prosecutor, and it was just like, it just fit. I had a blast. I had a lot of fun doing it. I got compliments afterwards, and it meant the world to me. I mean, it just was like, oh, this is something I'm good at. This is something I really like doing. And my neighbors that I were like my age and a couple years younger that we spent a ton of time with, their dad was an attorney, and so I got like his old book of Missouri revised statutes and just would flip through the Missouri code, and so it just built in me this desire for argumentation, for law, for kind of that mode of thinking. And
Mhm.
then I did debate in high school and college, and then went to Georgetown for law school. That kind of brought me out to DC. And and by the way, so my parents have a pool business. They clean pools, and through this connection, they cleaned the pool of a guy who ran the records department at a local law firm. And so, since they knew I was interested in the law, my mom kind of talked me up to him. So when I turned 16, he gave me a job as just like data entry, and kind of got a foot in the door there. And so then, fast forward 9 years, I take the bar, and I guess, yeah, 9 years. I take the bar and pass, and they invite me to come work for them as a litigator.
Nice. Okay. So, what's your favorite lawyer joke?
Oh man. Um, there's a joke that I have a fondness for, not because it's that great of a joke, but because a priest, when I was a seminarian at another point in life, and a priest introduced me at church, which I don't love the context of like telling a joke during mass in this way, but it was a funny joke in the context and everything, where he was just talking about a couple who dies before like the day before their wedding, and they go up to heaven, and they're totally happy in heaven, except they're always kind of sad that they didn't get a chance to get married. So God says, fine, fine. If you're still unhappy, come back in 6 months. And they come back, and they're like, yeah, we still would like to. And so this goes on for like 2 years. And finally God's like, okay, go down the hall, third door on the left, there's a priest there, he will marry you. And 6 months later, they're like, you know what, I think that might have been a mistake, I think we need to get a divorce. And God says, it took me 2 years to find a priest, and now you want a lawyer? So as a former attorney who was studying for the priesthood, I was just like, oh, that's a good one. I'll have to remember that one. It's wrong theologically. It doesn't make a lot of, but it's a clever kind of joke.
Yeah, no, that's great. I guess my favorite theologically inaccurate joke would be a wealthy man, he dies, he's very generous with his money. He arrives at the pearly gates, and he just asks St. Peter, he's just like, "Hey, I know you can't take it with you, but I did so much good with my gold. Could you allow me just to bring in one gold bar?" St. Peter's just like, "Okay, fine, just one." Okay, but don't tell anybody that I'll let you do this. It's like, oh, thank you, St. Peter. Let's go. And he grabs his gold bar, and he walks into heaven. And St. Peter's just shaking his head and goes, "Wonder why that guy wanted to bring in some pavement."
That's great. Nice. Yeah, it's
Yeah,
actually much more theologically accurate than than mine.
yeah. So okay, so you said that you were studying for the priesthood. So were you a cradle Catholic, or did you convert?
I like to say yes to that question. So
Okay.
I was raised Catholic. This was not a golden age of catechesis. So my
Mm,
parents, tried to instill kind of the Catholic faith in us, and a good Christian sensibility. And so
mm,
this meant that we were absorbing a lot of conflicting ideas that were all kind of under the broad umbrella
mm,
of Christianity. We listened to a lot of evangelical Protestant radio. And so I joked that we were one of the few Catholic families that were really like rapture ready. When 1999 was going to become 2000, we were like, I don't know about this. Like, God likes round numbers apparently, and
mm,
it didn't happen. Spoiler alert. But there was, a lot of that kind of wonky theology. So there was this process where I had like some real, true Catholic beliefs mixed with some misconceptions I picked up along the way from a variety of places. And this got really kind of challenged and purified throughout college and throughout law school. And it was really in the process of discovering what the church really taught that
mm,
I came to really fall in love in a really renewed way. And that
mm,
led me to starting the Shameless Popery blog, because I I wanted to share this with other people. I just thought, wow, I can't believe I didn't know, here I've been Catholic my whole life. I didn't know any of this stuff. This stuff is so fascinating, so interesting. And so it's just really life-changing. So in that sense, I have the feeling of being a convert in some ways, of like
yeah.
discovering a birthright I didn't know was mine. But also have, some of the weirder parts of Catholicism never seemed that weird to me because I grew up in them.
Okay. Yeah, I guess it's just one of those like it's like we're eating God. It's like, yeah, no, I remember my first communion. So
Yeah.
yeah. Okay,
Yeah.
well, cool. Okay, so you mentioned you started the Shameless Popery blog. How'd you come up with that name?
So I was actually in class. It was my second year of law school. And I started working on it earlier in the day and I hadn't finished. I had an evening class. And so I was like trying to come up with names and I'm going through all these different names and they're too pompous sounding, like Catholicism Contra Mundum and Catholic Defense and all the, and they were taking themselves too seriously. And I didn't
Right.
like the sound of any of them. And so Don Roth, good friend of mine who is a Dutch Reformed Calvinist, teaches at a Calvinist college now, uh, it just says shameless popery. It just was like, it took him 5 seconds to come up with the name. And I thought it was hilarious. And I thought, yep, that captures it. Because on the one hand, like I am unabashedly Catholic. On the other hand, I try not to take myself too seriously.
Mm-hmm.
And I thought this name kind of captured both aspects. The only problem is people don't know how to spell popery.
Is it potpourri or potpourri?
Yeah, exactly. And well, I guess the flip side is, so back in the day, like early on, I would actually check to see like what kind of search terms did people use to get here, and occasionally you'd find people who, yeah, they were looking for potpourri and they didn't know how to spell that.
That's fantastic.
Yeah.
Oh man. Yeah, no, I've tried to name my channel something creative. As you can see by the channel name, I've failed miserably. But well, because like originally it's like, oh, let's do a play on my name. I'll call it Our Wits End and spell it with an H. And all that did was like whenever you tried to search for the channel on YouTube, it like corrected you, like, oh, looks like you accidentally put an H there. We're not going to show you any of this guy's stuff.
Yeah, there you go.
And,
Yeah, that's the hard part is there's a lot of those where you're just like, yeah, I guess there's a whole broader world. Yeah, my problem actually now, I said the one problem is people can't spell potpourri. Well, now the other problem is if you type in shameless in Spotify to get the audio version of the podcast, the first results are not edifying. We'll put it that way. And so you have to start typing that second word real fast.
So. Dang. Okay. Yeah. So, okay. So you got into just learning the faith while in law school? Like, is that what you said? Like,
well, it started in college. So there was kind of two phases of it. So my RA in college is now Father Andrew Strobel, and he and I had known each other since my entire life. Our parents met in a young adult group when they were young adults. And so they were good friends. And he is 3 years older than I am. So I always kind of looked up to him. And he was a debater. We were on the same high school debate team. He recruited me to the college I went to. And he was one of the finest debaters I've ever seen. And I also had this tendency to buy really poor quality cars that would break down. And so I like to euphemistically say we carpooled from Kansas City to Topeka, which is about 75 minutes. But the reality is I had a broken down car a lot and I would just bum rides with him and I'd like pay for gas, but he was doing all the work. And then if that wasn't bad enough, I would pepper him the entire ride with objections to Catholicism. Just like, why does the Catholic Church believe X, Y, Z? And the thing is, and I was never like fully hostile. I was just a little unbelieving about it. I wasn't like firmly convinced it was wrong. I just was not convinced this was right, that it was true. And every time he came back with an explanation that made sense, whatever issue I came up with, he had something. And every time I would think like, okay, that kind of works out. That kind of makes sense. I wasn't necessarily convinced every time, but I could see how a smart person might hold those beliefs. And the thing is that when that happens once or twice, that's fine. You can live with that. When that starts to happen a dozen times, you start to think, wait a second. All of these silver bullets I thought I had, they're not succeeding. Maybe there really is something to this. And so that led to me being kind of intellectually convinced of the truth of Catholicism early on in college. The second half of college, my roommate was a Presbyterian, and a pretty serious Presbyterian in some ways. And so we would debate religion and all this. But I think I can speak for both of us when I say our lives didn't always reflect our theological convictions. And then finally, my senior year, I was pursuing actually one of his ex-girlfriends who was a Pentecostal. I know. Look, not my finest moment, but God works through any of this. So I am trying to date one of his ex-girlfriends and succeeded, by the way, for like a couple of years.
For those of you keeping score.
Yeah, for those. Yeah, I mean, Neither of us married her. Whatever. It doesn't matter. Uh, but there was a convicting moment because we would talk religion, and she was very fervent, very devout,
Mhm.
even very holy Pentecostal. And so intellectually, I mean, the case for Catholicism is a lot stronger than the case for any form of Pentecostalism. But
Mhm.
she has this moment where she just says, okay, you know what you're saying makes sense, but if this is true, why don't you live like it? And it was just a total gut punch. I mean, it was just, I had no answer because
Mhm.
she was absolutely right. And so that started the kind of 1,000-mile journey from the head to the heart,
Mhm.
where I had to actually live like the things I'd been saying were true actually were true. And, I mean, obviously, like, that's an ongoing thing, right? Like, it's easier to say, Jesus is Lord. I believe the church is his church. Does my daily life reflect that? Do my priorities reflect that? Do I reflect that in the way that I treat others, in the way that I, all of that stuff? Like, sin is a counter witness to the gospel. And so I'd given sin too much place in my life in a variety of forms. And so this was a real moment of conviction. After this, I go off to DC to law school. She actually goes out to DC to work for a spy agency.
Mhm.
And I kind of spy an opportunity, right? Like, let's move before she knows anybody else. And so I convinced her to come to Mass with me. And it was life changing for both of us. She comes to believe in the Eucharist at the moment of consecration. And I have this deep, hard to describe, deeper conversion. Um, Later, so the church is Our Lady of Angels in Woodbridge, Virginia. The priest is Father Keith O'Hare. And I remember it still. I mean, this was 2007.
Mhm.
And another priest once said of him, when he genuflects, you get the sense he means it. And
Mhm.
he just had like a profound reverence. Like, it's frankly like not that beautiful of a church. It's an A-frame church. It's not a super wealthy parish. It doesn't have all the normal trappings you might associate with good liturgy, but it was incredibly beautiful and just an incredibly reverent experience. And at the end of it, so the parish is maybe like, I don't know, maybe a third Salvadorian. And at the end of Mass, I remember this group of Salvadorian kids just going up to the foot of the altar. And the kid who's maybe 5 just genuflects and he's showing his little sister who's like 2 or 3
Aw.
how to reverence the altar. And it was so moving and so profound that it was like I got a little choked up just witnessing it. Like, oh wow. And we were talking earlier about those things you learn from little kids, and this was one of those
Mhm.
experiences. And I remember coming out from that mass and just saying, Father, that was amazing. How was your
Mhm.
mass that reverent? Like, I didn't have a vocabulary even for it.
Right.
And he says, and if you're familiar with the Diocese of Arlington, this will make sense. He just says, "Oh, you're in the Diocese of Arlington now. That was nothing." Which, and his point was, you can find more pomp and circumstance in a lot of other places, which was true.
Mhm.
But the reverence, there's just a quality. I can't describe it any better than that, other than that it was an incredibly convicting experience to be in a room full of people who lived like this was true and worshiped like it was true. And knowing like it made a difference. It changed my life.
That's awesome. Wow. Okay. So, okay, I guess let's moving the chronology ahead a little bit. Okay, so you've graduated college, graduated law school. You're okay. So I keep saying litigator because I'm not quite sure what that is, and that's what it said on your website.
Oh,
So,
sure. Yeah. A litigator
yeah,
is just a lawyer who likes conflict. No, it's like you got all sorts of different lawyers, right? You've got those who handle like wills and estates and trusts, and you got contract lawyers. You got a lot of the kind of legalese, non-conflict lawyers. But when everything goes south, when things fall apart, then there's a lawsuit, and that's in technical terms litigation.
okay.
And so we don't do criminal stuff. It's not like the cops. But
Hmm.
if two private parties are battling it out and it really escalates, that's when we would get called in. And so, everything from I handled or I was involved with a case where a doctor was being sued by an insurance company and he kind of had his own counterclaims against them. A woman who was a homeowner who hired some contractors and they dug underneath her house and her house collapsed. All like that kind of stuff. Like when things fall
Yeah.
apart in those ways, then you can really use a litigator. So
Okay.
it's the kind of law that a former debater likes to do. I guess I'll put it that way.
Okay. Gotcha. So you're you. I guess you would be like that guy who was like playing Dungeons and Dragons or whatever, that you knew the most like obscure rules to like, you can't do that. So,
Yeah, there's something to that. That is not an inaccurate description. And so there really is this, you you get a lot of credit for being able to find obscure law stuff. You get a lot of credit for being able to make good arguments. And so there's a good challenge there. It was a lot of fun to do. I really, people assume because I was a lawyer for only a very short period of time, about a year and a half. And so people assume I must have hated it. And the truth was, I really enjoyed it. It was
no.
stressful. I started grinding my teeth in my sleep, which was a thing I'd never done before. So I was definitely bringing home a lot of stress, but
Mhm.
the adrenaline and kind of all of that stuff, I really enjoyed that. And in writing briefs and all, the writing and stuff behind the scenes. Um, yeah, I enjoyed it a lot.
Gotcha. So, okay, so where did you okay, so I guess why did you leave?
Yeah, I left because I started to get the strong sense I was being called to seminary. I mentioned that I was dating this former girlfriend of my roommate's, who was a former Pentecostal, now Catholic. Oh, yeah, she converted to Catholicism. I don't know if that was clear from the story.
Oh, sweet.
Well, her mom was still Pentecostal. And her mom starts to ask her why I'm not discerning the priesthood. And that's like a big red flag. Because I liked her. It was not like she was like, get rid of this guy. She was
Uh,
just like, are you sure God's not inviting him to become a Catholic priest? Which is weird because I'm like, you don't really believe in the Catholic priesthood, but
mhm.
nevertheless, you pray a lot. And so enough things like that started to happen in a really narrow period of time that I kind of laughed it off, and started to think, wait a second. And then I was at a men's group and I mentioned it sort of in passing, sort of half jokingly. And the priest who was there was like, you can't just ignore that. And he told me the story about St. Ambrose of Milan, who I think was also an attorney, but I may be wrong about that. He settled, I think, well, I guess he was the mayor or governor, whatever, of Milan. And he
Mm.
settled a riot in the city. And the riot was over who was going to be the next bishop. And they started clamoring for him to be their bishop. And he had not like discerned this internally. And the priest's point was like, there's this way in which sometimes if the Holy Spirit can't convince you internally and you're not paying attention or you're not open enough in prayer, he'll just start talking to people around you. And like, if you can't hear the still small voice of God, maybe you can hear your neighbor's voice.
Hmm.
And so there's that is actually, and that's a good rule of discernment. Not you like that can't be the end of your discernment. But if someone around you, certainly if a lot of people around you are saying, I think God is calling you in this direction, you should definitely take that to prayer. You should definitely tune in and
Mm.
try to take that seriously. So all that's to say, this results in me ending that relationship and then entering seminary. And I was in seminary for like 5 years.
Nice. Which seminary?
2 years at Kenrick Glennon in St. Louis and 3 years at the North American College in Rome.
Okay, cool. So I live in St. Louis. So how did you enjoy Kenrick Glennon, where the air is approximately 40% bullets?
No, Kenrick Glennon was great. I liked Richmond Heights. I will say the most oppressive thing about St. Louis is the Cardinals fans. And as a person from Kansas City, that took a little bit of getting used to. It like St. Louis is so funny because it really is a town that has a strange sense of identity. I'll give you 3 examples. Number one, it's a town that's fanatical about an okay custard shop, by which I mean Ted Drew's. And it's like, yeah, that's fine. But like that's the kind of thing you expect a town of like 5,000 to be really like proud of. Like, we've got a shop that sells custard. St. Louis is a giant city. And so it's
Right.
like, yeah, like you've got an ice cream shop. Everybody has an ice cream shop.
Yeah.
And so it's great. It's whatever. But I thought it was kind of charming that people got that into Ted Drew's. I mean, Archbishop Naumann has a stencil drawing of Ted Drew's in his house. It's like, what is going on here? So that's one thing. Two, it doesn't know if it's on the East Coast or not. And if you look at a map, it's not, but it certainly is like the westernmost East Coast city, whereas Kansas City feels much more like a West Coast city. Like in a lot of ways, some of them
Mhm.
intangible. Like St. Louis feels much more like Philadelphia than it does like Kansas City. So that's the other sort of like, that's an interesting phenomenon. And then the third is the one everybody brings up, which is, where did you go to school? Like what do
Yeah,
you mean
where'd you go to high
college?
school? It's just
Yeah, if they say
I
where did you go
don't
to
get it.
school, here they mean like college, there they mean high school.
Yeah,
And it tells you apparently a lot about their demographic or what kind of person they are. I never really got this. I understand New Orleans is the same way. Uh, and so this was all of this was just like a fascinating kind of different environment. And so in a lot of ways, I mean, Kansas City and St. Louis are, not that dissimilar. They're both
right.
Midwestern cities, but there were just certain features that were like, oh, that's really interesting and striking. And I'm a little bit of a foreigner in a different culture that I don't completely understand.
I've lived here for now 5 years, so my wife is from St. Louis. So that's another thing
Oh,
about
what school
St.
did you? I'm just kidding.
She went to a tiny, tiny private Christian school that nobody's ever heard of.
She
So
gets out of this one. Okay, fair
yeah,
enough.
she does, but, like, that's another thing about St. Louis women. They call this a salmon city because the women go out to find their husbands and then bring them back here to have their babies. So,
I've never heard that before, but
yes, well,
there you
'cause
go.
we go to the Institute of Christ the King Oratory
Mhm.
in South St. Louis,
Is that St.
and
Francis de Sales?
yes.
Nice.
So,
Largest church in the city, right?
no, not by a long shot. No, the
Oh, I guess the
cathedral is way
cathedral. Yeah,
bigger.
yeah, never mind. I
Yeah.
take it back.
Um,
I was thinking it was the tallest. I guess no, it doesn't make
it's
sense.
got the
You're right.
tallest steeple, yes.
Oh, okay, that's what it is. That's what it is.
Yeah. But yeah, so, like, here we are standing in, like, a group of men, and, we've got a priest from France, we got a priest from Illinois, and, we've got all these different guys standing around, and nobody's from St. Louis. And I just kinda looked around, and it was just like, "Well, how about that? The
Yeah.
love of our life all brought us here."
Exactly. That's funny.
So, yeah, but no, like, I don't know, St. Louis is fun, just
It
I don't know.
definitely like I grew up kind of half seriously hating on it. I was born in '85, which is when the Royals I think beat the Cardinals in the World Series. I have to double check that.
I'm
And
not a
so there's
baseball
kind of
guy,
like
so
a jokey, sparry thing, but
mhm.
truth is, I really enjoyed my time there. I really liked St. Louis. It grew on me a lot and very quickly. And the
Yeah.
people there are very nice. I mean, it's a friendly
Yeah, once you get, like, out of the city. So,
town.
yeah. I say that, like, I've been held up at gunpoint in the church parking
Oh
lot, so it's
shoot.
just yeah, so,
I
good
did not
time.
have that experience. That is less friendly for sure.
Yeah, yeah. So, okay, so you go to seminary. I assume you discerned out and they didn't kick you out
That
for
is correct. I
okay,
loved seminary. I've joked with my wife that if I could just be in seminary for life, I would be. But as
nice.
I was getting close to actual ordination, I had, because I was almost on autopilot. Not like I was doing it half-heartedly, but I was throwing myself into studies, and I was in Rome, and I was traveling around Europe and having a blast. And I was doing
Mhm.
great in school. I was, having a lot of fun with the seminarians, forming good friendships, having good theological conversations, having the time of my life in a lot of ways. Uh, and I just assumed that meant that I was, where I was supposed to be. I was totally at peace. I was having a blast, like I said.
Right.
But as I was getting closer to ordination, I didn't have the joy I needed to have to be able to move forward and say yes. And
Mm,
that was alarming. So I'm simplifying kind of a longer story there, but that was a good
right.
sign that I needed to take this to prayer, maybe put the brakes on kind of the conveyor belt, and not just end up a deacon and end up a priest. And so I stopped, and it certainly was the right decision. I was able when I was like when I entered marriage, I had the joy I was missing. So I know it
Mm,
wasn't just like I was incapable of joy or something like that. Um,
nice.
it just was, there's a way in which there's certain hallmarks of a
Mm,
good discernment. Like there's a certain peace you can only get from Christ. And I was looking for things I knew he and only he could provide, and I couldn't give myself. I wasn't seeing them there, and I did see them with marriage.
nice. Okay. So, is it true that after you discern out of seminary, like, they, like, issue you a spouse?
It's, my wife has described seminary as charm school for men. And I think she's onto something there because look, it's like this. Like in seminary, people will correct you if you have poor table manners. In college, they won't. And that's a small thing. You can have some pretty badly formed seminarians who come out badly formed either as priests or as
Mhm.
ex-seminarians, but you kind of have to really manage to fail to have that happen. You know what I mean? Like every human check that you could kind of think of is in place. You have psychological evaluations. You've got people who very candidly, very bluntly will tell you when you're doing things wrong. And so, in a healthy seminary, at least,
Hmm.
it really is screening for a lot of spiritual defects and human defects. And those things would keep you from being the saint you're meant to be. So, in that sense, I think it makes sense. It sounds very boastful to be like, oh, of course, like seminarians. But in a world in which there's a shortage of serious Catholic men, and in a world in which there's a shortage of people who've taken human formation as seriously as they should,
Hmm.
I think seminarians come out with a real edge in that sense. So I've known a lot of former seminarians, and the ones I've known who haven't gotten married within a pretty short span of time, it's usually because they had something they were trying to work on. That they weren't ready to get married. It wasn't that no one wanted to marry them.
Gotcha.
So that's
So,
that's a very weird advertisement for seminary. But if you're looking to get married, seminary is a great preparation.
ladies, hang outside the gates. So catch them on
Don't
the
do
way
that.
out.
Don't do that.
Okay. Well, cool. So, um, okay. So cool. So you do that. I imagine. So you meet your wife shortly thereafter after seminary.
I'd known her for a while. We were
Oh.
friends, and so there was no scandal there. But I'd actually stopped talking to her close to towards the end of the process when I started to realize, oh, I might not become a priest. I pushed a couple of female friends away just because I thought, it's not helping.
Hmm.
I was a big believer. There's a thing John Paul II talks about basically the need for priests to have female friends, and he
Hmm.
lived this himself. And I'm a believer in this. I think there's sometimes a temptation in seminary or in priesthood to say I need to avoid all women, and I think that's actually unhealthy.
Hmm.
But I think when you're in the process of discerning whether you're called to priesthood or marriage, there is a time and place to say, okay, let's step back from the world and step back from anything that may be clouding my judgment. So yeah, that was kind of the approach I went with.
Okay. Cool. So so you did that. So you knew your wife already. You guys get
Mhm.
married. So what are you doing for a living after that?
Yeah. So I immediately started working for a group called School of Faith or Holy Family School of Faith Institute. And it's two Steubenville grads who started it. And the basic idea is they work with the Archdiocese of Kansas City, Kansas. And they actually, for a while, they spread much broader than that. And doing things like faith formation for primary and secondary school teachers and doing talks in the Archdiocese of Kansas City, Kansas. And, it's sort of a similar thing to what I'm doing at Catholic Answers, but at a much more localized level where
Okay.
almost everything I did was in the Kansas City metro area. So
Gotcha.
it was a nice little kind of preparation, I think, in some ways. I didn't think of it that way at the time, but in
Hmm.
hindsight, it's like, oh yeah, this prepared me well for what I do now.
Gotcha. Okay. So cool. And then did you go from there to Catholic Answers or?
I did. So in March of 2020, I think,
Hmm.
I started working. No, 2021 in March sometime. I don't remember when. Yeah, no, it must have been 2021. I'm not 100% sure of that. Yeah, I started working for Catholic Answers. Yeah, it was
Oh,
2021. That's right, because my wife was pregnant with my son, so it was nice to get health insurance.
nice.
So
Nice.
yeah,
Okay.
it was yeah, and it was very nice. I'd already done a lot of work with Catholic Answers. Actually, when I was still a seminarian, I'd been on Catholic Answers Live, and I had started writing a book right after seminary, Pope Peter, and so I already had a lot of fingers in a lot of pies with Catholic Answer that I'd written for the website. And so when they did offer me a job, it was kind of like, okay, so I could get paid for what I've been doing for you for basically free. This is not hard discernment. Like
Yeah.
there's a time and place where it's like discernment is very difficult, and then there's like the free money kind of discernment. And you're just
Do
like,
you
yeah,
eat the beautiful steak that was just put in front
yeah,
of you?
exactly. Like,
Yeah.
yeah, yeah.
Yeah. Okay. Um, all right, yeah, because it's a fun story. Like, so this is one of those things where like you impact people's lives and you didn't even realize it. So whenever I first started out this channel, it was just kind of nonsense and there's a lot of work and you have no idea what you're doing and whatnot. And at one point, I had like determined that I was just going to give up. Like, I was just going to delete the channel and like leave it alone, whatever. And then like that day, Trent put out a video of like how to become an apologist, and like you featured quite heavily in that. and he was saying like, is like, well, well, how do you become an apologist? Well, you just start doing apologetics. And he used your website as an example of like, if you come to Catholic Answers and say, hey, I want to be an apologist, it'll be like, okay, show me your portfolio. If you don't have anything, it'll be like, okay, bye. So
yeah,
but
I'm a big believer in that. Partly because, I mean, for a lot of reasons. This is not something that takes a ton of money to do at the basic level. You're talking to people about Jesus Christ. And if you can't do that without any money, without any support, then it's not worth giving you the money or support to do that. I know that I don't know if that makes sense or not, but
yeah.
you want the people who are fanatical about it, you want the people who love it, and you want the people who are gonna do it anyway. Someone who is just a job for is not the right fit. And so you want someone who is gonna say, look, I am called by God to reach people for Jesus in this particular way. That's not everybody's gifting. It's not everybody's calling. I mean, everyone is called to evangelize in some way, but some people are really called for this to just be their full-time kind of ministry. And if that's the case, then by all means, let's cultivate that for you. Let's help you do that better. Let's give you more of a platform. But if that's not the case, if you're just looking to make a paycheck, or if you're, you don't want that. So it's nice working at Catholic Answers because you just don't really sweat, making sure everybody's working, because of course they are, because they are held to a higher standard than, John or Chris or any of the bosses. They're held to the standard of, yeah, God has invited me to this. He's given me these gifts and talents, and I want to glorify him. So I don't know. I don't know if that makes sense, but that is the kind of thing that we're looking for. So I agree with Trent completely. That's the hallmark of a good apologist. You shouldn't have a big question mark when you come in the door. Like, we should already know, okay, well, we know you know how to write. We know you know how to speak because you've been doing it.
Gotcha. So you mentioned that you had been working on your book, Pope Peter. How did that come about? Like, did you get invited to write a book? Because I know absolutely nothing about like the publishing process. So how does that
That's
work?
a great question. I don't remember how the actual back and forth worked. So I know this: the original idea for Pope Peter, I had, on Shameless Popery, I used to blog all the time. Now, for those people watching now who are younger, I don't think you know how crazy the world of blogging was. That, I mean, if you go back and look, I've done this sometimes just to like remind myself this was real. It would be like a 10,000 word blog post. Like, this is a lengthy thing. And then you'd have 500 comments, and it would be people who were really like, people who were like well-known Catholics would jump in, and people who were well-known Protestants and atheists would actually just kind of jump in the comments. And it wasn't just horrible. It was actually like lively, fruitful, pleasant conversations. And I don't know exactly what changed. I think Facebook became easier to have conversations on. And
Yeah.
so a lot of this moved away from blogs towards social media platforms. And then those became more like segregated into echo chambers, and it kind of killed this culture. But there really was this golden age where it was, I don't know, it was tremendously beautiful. Anyway, in the course of this, I was posting multiple times a week. And for my birthday week, I decided to do 5 posts all about Peter's role as Pope. And that was the kind of original nucleus that became Pope Peter. I kind of revised, updated, cleaned up those arguments a little bit because they went through the ringer in the comments, and they came outstanding, I thought. So I thought, okay, like these seem like they're good arguments. Because that's the other thing that was really great is you got very quick kind of feedback. If you made a bad argument, you would usually know by the next day.
Nice.
That was,
I can't remember what rule of it is of the internet, but basically it's that if you want a correct answer, the quickest way to get it on the internet is not to ask the question, but to post a wrong answer.
Right. Yeah, it's remarkable. The desire to correct strangers is so strange, but it is a very strong desire, and it is kind of the fuel for the internet. Because
Yeah.
I saw someone do this. They just said Murphy's Law is the rule that if you want to know something, you don't just ask for the answer. You give the wrong answer. And someone quickly said, "It's not Murphy's Law. Here's what it is," and it demonstrated exactly what they were talking about. So.
That's amazing. Oh man. So All right. Well, cool. So you've been in this game for a hot minute then. What
Yeah,
are some of
14 years.
nice. So dang, that tells me I got a long way to go then. But they so what are some of the cool stories of like, people coming up to you is like, "Hey, when you explained this, it really clicked."
Gosh, I have a few, and there's some that are just so there's one in particular I always go back to because it reminds me of how little of this is really me. So back in the day, there was a fellow by the name of Harold Camping, now deceased, God rest his soul. And he was the head of a group called Family Radio. And when I was living in DC, they had a radio station there. And the music was great. And they would have times where they would just read from the Bible and they just 40 minutes of just reading from Joshua. And it was great. It was just like, oh, I love it. But they were really into the end times. And they had this prediction the world was going to end in 2012. And they had the first, it was in April or May. And then they moved it back 6 months. Um, yeah, I guess it was May. Yeah, I don't remember. April or May, end of April. And then I know the second one was right around October. And so I decided to live blog the apocalypse because they said Jesus is coming back. And they said he's coming back such and such a date at 7 p.m. And I thought it was so funny they said 7 p.m. because there wasn't a time zone. And it was like, guys, how is this going to be like a rolling apocalypse? Like, how is this
This
going to
is
work?
we need to be on the phone with the Australians just 'cause
Yeah.
they're facing it first.
Oh, that's exactly where my mind went. And at the time, there was this blog called New Zealand Conservative that linked to mine. And so I was aware of them, and occasionally if I saw some they'd post, I might jump in the comments. And so I jump in the comments to say, "Hey, how are the earthquakes going? Blah blah blah." And unbeknownst to me, they just had like a really devastating earthquake.
Oh, jeez.
Yes. And so what looked like just a lighthearted whatever was just abhorrently bad taste. And I didn't know this.
Oh,
And so
no.
a woman who I just saw in the comments of your is watching this video right now, so she can write and correct if my memory fails me here. She sees this like really poor taste post and she thinks like, okay, I'm gonna get him back. What is he like? What does he care about? So then she starts reading Shameless Popery, and at the time I have like a list of blogs that I link to, and one of them is called the Communion, which is a bunch of former Reformed Christians who became Catholics and brilliant guys. Brian Cross, a bunch of really smart fellows. And so she starts reading Shameless Popery. She starts reading Called to Communion. One thing leads to another, and she becomes Catholic. Sends me the most baffling email because I still don't know any of this is happening. Like, this was just like a comment you make and then totally forget about. And it started this like crazy spiral of events that somehow, in one of the most embarrassing moments where I just like make a total fool of myself internationally on the internet, God used that moment to bring someone into the church. And so I don't know. I feel like that gave me a kind of green light to feel like, okay, don't worry about doing this perfectly because even at your worst, God can use that.
Yeah, I've heard Matt Fradd say it. I don't know if he's the who coined this phrase, but it's like, God can use your BS as the manure of his garden. So,
Exactly.
yeah.
That is quite right.
Yeah,
And he does that frequently. So,
nice.
I thank him for that.
Nice. So we got a question from Braden, who runs the channel, The Catechumen. He's got some pretty cool stuff. But he asks, in your opinion, what's the best thing someone could start doing regularly if they want to have a future in apologetics?
That's a very good question. I'd give multifaceted answer. One, figure out what your passion or strength is within the context of apologetics. So, in other words, I came from a background where I absorbed a ton of Protestant theology from a pretty young age. And so even though I wasn't a convert, I'm relatively conversant in the kind of the world of evangelical Protestantism. I know kind of who the major figures are and all this, and even have like an appreciation and respect for many of them. And that made it a natural kind of launching point where I could say, okay, like I know why I'm Catholic and not Protestant. And those are just going to be totally different issues than why I'm a Christian and not an atheist.
Right.
And so I can appeal to scripture. I can say, here's John 6 on the Eucharist. That's not going to convince my atheist friend. And so the first thing I'd say is not narrow your focus excessively, but figure out what your passion is within the kind of broader world of apologetics. So, like Trent, for example, is fantastic at pro life work. I love that, by the way. I love all of that, but he's just like, he's always been really deep in that. And so he's sort of the go-to guy, if that makes sense. And there are people who can just do kind of anything and everything, but for especially when you're starting out, you probably want to get really good at one or two areas and expand from there. And don't be afraid to dabble in other areas, but kind of figure out what your strength is or what your passion is, what your interest is. Second, do a lot of reading. So St. Thomas Aquinas has a really helpful sermon called Puer Jesus, which just means the boy Jesus. And he's looking at Luke 2. And so in Luke 2, we have this moment that's sometimes called like Jesus among the teachers, you know, it's a finding in the temple. And the mental image, and a lot of times religious art shows Jesus teaching the teachers. But that's not what Luke 2 actually says. It says he's listening to them and asking them good questions. And so Aquinas argues that this is how you begin. Like you have to just listen and ask good questions. And Aquinas' own life reveals this, right? Like when he's in seminary, his nickname is the dumb ox because he doesn't say anything. He's just listening and absorbing everything. And when he finally does have something to say, it's incredible. But there's a long time before he gets there. He's a seminarian. He does a commentary on St. Peter's sentences and St. Peter Lombard. And so like he's not doing his own theology until sort of late in the game. And so that process, you know, we're very quick to want to say, here are my 2 cents. But if you jump into that too quickly, you'll be shallow and you'll have very little to say and you'll make a lot of mistakes and you'll be kind of dismissed. And so don't be afraid to take the time to really build those things up. On the flip side to that, there's a constant process of kind of learning by trial and error. And that's one of the things that, like I said, was really nice about the world of blogging. And I think this is true on social media as well, where you can present an argument and people can very quickly give you feedback if it's good or bad. So don't be afraid to admit that you've made a mistake. Don't be afraid to, you know, fail and then just let that be a learning opportunity for you. Many of the things I've most remembered have been times where I've gotten something wrong. And it's like, well, I'm never going to make that particular mistake again. And so it's something I've learned. And so that's really helpful. So don't just like spend your entire life reading and never speaking. But it's one way of kind of making those 2 points fit together is it's okay to say, is this a good argument? It seems to me like XYZ, and invite people to kind of give you feedback on it. And this being the internet, right? Like people will happily give you feedback on it. And so that's, I don't know, another way you can do it. Obviously, I guess fourth thing I'd say here, and this really should have been first, this needs to be rooted in prayer. Like when one of the reasons you read is because you need to receive before you have anything to give. This is also why you need to pray. I mean, for a lot of reasons you need to pray, but one of them is that if you're not praying, you're running on your own steam and you're not going to get very far. When Jesus says, apart from me, you can do nothing, he doesn't mean you can do a whole lot, but not everything. He means you can do nothing. So I guess those would be kind of the initial things I would say. Beyond that, just, spend a lot of time writing, a lot of time speaking, a lot of time editing your own work and trying to get it as succinct and pithy as it can be and as persuasive as it can be.
Nice. Yeah. Not that anybody asked for my 2 cents on this, but I'm going to give it anyway.
Hey, what would you say?
Exactly what Drew the Catholic says. The answer is to turn it into a drinking game. But no, like I really like what you're saying. Like the reminder that like Jesus, without Jesus, you can do nothing. Apart from him, you can do nothing. And I recently saw this meme floating around Facebook, and it was just like, it's like, you think that you don't need Jesus to get to heaven, bro. It's like without Jesus, you can't get to heaven, bro. Without Jesus, you can't get to Walmart.
Exactly.
So,
I don't think we fully appreciate how much we are metaphysically dependent upon him for every moment. Like, it's not just like, oh, you'll die. It's like you would cease to exist without God constantly sustaining you and being.
yeah.
You would be non-existent. It's I can't even describe this to you because we don't have kind of a frame for that. The radical contingency of our being. I experienced this very viscerally with my 3-year-old. So she likes to look at. So we have like a photo montage that shows up like Google Photos. So sometimes we'll just like let that play. And so she sees pictures from like our wedding day, and she's like, "Was that when I was in mommy's tummy?" And we're like, "No, you have to stop saying like, stop saying you were in your mom's tummy on our wedding day. That is not true. People are gonna get the wrong idea." She just can't imagine a world where she didn't exist.
Yeah.
Uh, I don't know. That was so. It just is a reminder. I can't imagine a world in some ways in which I don't exist. I can kind of theoretically. I can talk about ancient cultures, and I know it wasn't there.
Right.
But the fact that I need not be here and I'm totally dependent on God, it's a good reminder.
Nice. Nice. So now one of the things if you could just sum up an entire book that you wrote in 3 sentence now. But your book, The Early Church is the Catholic Church. How did that come about? Did that just kind of happen like because you were just exploring some stuff, or is that like something that somebody asked you to research?
That's a good question. You know what? I should know the origins of these things more. I think I proposed to Todd, who's the editor at Catholic Answers, a book called Before Constantine, where I just looked at the church before Constantine. Because there's a lot of times there's a popular myth that says before Constantine, Christians believed the thing I believe. So if you're a Protestant, the early Christians were Protestant, or if you're,
Mhm.
Dan Brown, the early church believed what Dan Brown believes. All of those things. And then, Battle of Constantine comes along and legalizes Christianity, and usually in this version of the story, creates Christianity as the official religion of the Roman Empire, which he didn't actually do. And then all the bad Catholic stuff happens then. And that story is false in a lot of ways. I wanted to do that. The problem is like, well, one, this isn't 2012, and Da Vinci Code isn't flying off the shelves, and so like we
Thank God
have
for
to,
that.
like, and so he suggested something a little more like differently tailored and to go earlier. And so I ended up going very early and just saying, okay, let's look at just the first 200 years. Oh, so he also he suggested the title in response. The early church was the Catholic Church. That was his title, and that was from a Catholic Answers conference. And that gave me actually a greater sense of clarity and kind of what to do with the book, which was really helpful. And so then from there, I ended up choosing 4 areas, and based on kind of like a Protestant author I was reading about, looking at the fourfold aspect of the early church. And so I chose 4 areas, one from each of those aspects. And then, that was the book from there. So that was kind of how it came to be. The one sentence version of it is the early church was the Catholic Church.
Nice. Yeah. No, I'll be honest. That's one that so I recently purchased The Great Controversy. So where a lot of like the nonsense of Constantine started the Catholic Church and all that stuff comes from. So, it's amazing whenever you
Is that
read that.
Ellen Gold White?
Yes.
Yeah, that book is bananas.
Yeah. Oh, it's so funny because you like the first 3 pages and she's referencing Tertullian. It's like, okay, all right, looks like she's done her homework. And then the anti-Catholic nonsense starts and the references completely stop.
Yeah, she claims Constantine is the one who starts Sunday worship. And it's fun because like, okay, cool. Here's Justin Martyr in 150 or 160 explaining why Christians worship on Sunday. He just takes it for granted that we do and explains why.
Right.
Ignatius talks about this. The Didache talks about this. The book of Revelation refers to the Lord's Day, which in the context of the Didache, we know is Sunday. And so it's just like, okay, it doesn't seem like she knows what she's talking about.
Yeah. It's absolutely like bananas. I think is a good word for it. So Haley's asking if you're working on any books right now that you can talk about.
Yeah. So I am. In fact, well, I'm done with it. It's coming out in
Ooh.
July, I think. Everything's in the hands of the powers that be that make paper, trees, I guess.
Oh, okay.
So the book is on the Eucharist, and I like to explain it right now as a book about how the Eucharist explains everything else. So
Hmm.
there are a lot of books that just say, what do Catholics believe about the Eucharist and why? I want to go a step further and say, how is this Catholic belief about the Eucharist the key to making sense of the new covenant, the key to making sense of the bloody cross and the nature of blood sacrifice? How is this the key of making sense of like what true worship looks like in the Christian context? How is this key to making sense of the lives of the saints and the early Christians? And so I don't know if that makes sense, but it's that kind of idea of like this. On the road to Emmaus in the Gospel of Luke, Jesus is walking with them. He opens the scriptures for them, and their hearts are burning within them, but they don't recognize it's him. But then when they see him when they're actually in this liturgical context. So you've got the liturgy of the word, you've got the opening of the scriptures, you've got the preaching on them, and then you have the liturgy of the Eucharist where they're at table together and Jesus takes and blesses and breaks.
Mm-hmm.
And what's clearly this kind of Eucharistic language,
Right.
and says they recognize him in the breaking of the bread. And the breaking of the bread is how Luke describes the early Christian Eucharist. And it's only when that happens that they're able to look back and say, we're not our hearts burning within us. In other words, it's not just that Christ is present in the Eucharist. It's not just that this is his enduring presence and this is the way that he continues to be with us after the resurrection. It's also that in the light of the Eucharist, other things start to make sense. Now they understand what all that bit about the scriptures was about. They didn't before. Now with the Eucharist, they do. And so that's the idea. The Eucharist, we often talk about it kind of isolated by itself, but this is the source and the summit of the faith. And so it actually explains all the other parts of the faith.
Man, yeah, that's amazing. Actually, we saw Dr. Hahn in Nashville give basically that exact talk.
I'm afraid I'm sure he does a better job. I'm just glad to have written it before he did.
Yeah.
Because otherwise, I'd be like, I don't need to do this. Tom's already done it. He's phenomenal. I respect and admire a lot of apologists. I think Scott Hahn is in a league of his own.
Yeah. Well, have you considered, like, once the book is finally like published and whatnot, just send him a copy with a sticky note inside of it that just says "Take that, nerd." Like,
I might be able to do one better. I'm seeing him this fall at the Catholic Answers Conference, which anyone listening, CatholicAnswersConference.com. Scott Hahn's going to be there. I'm going to be there. I'm only going to be there maybe a short time. I'm going to have a baby that is newly born, so I might just duck in, duck out. But I'll definitely be there for part of it. I'm doing one of the talks. I'm hoping to maybe bring one of my kids and stay a little longer. We'll see. There's ongoing marital negotiations, but I'll hopefully get to see Scott Hahn there. Maybe I'll give him the book then.
Nice. Are you going to be doing the Defending the Faith conference?
No, I'm not.
Okay.
You should constantly press him to invite me. So.
Okay. Well, yeah, I hope to go there too. So, but yeah. So, let's see here. Got a few more questions. How much time you got?
I'm open to whatever. My kids are asleep. I'm wired on coffee. I'm good to go.
Okay. All right. Cool. So Drew the Catholic is asking, what's the main argument you find most Protestants need to hear to move towards conversion?
Good question. I think there's a few contenders. I'll give you a couple. I think one of the number one arguments that moves the dial is something along the lines of, what did the early Christians believe, or where did the Bible come from? The idea is really simple. If you just treat the Bible as this thing that fell from heaven, and its interpretation is whatever a 21st century American or whatever would come up with, then you end up with modern day Protestantism in a lot of its forms. But once you start to say, well, is that what Jesus wanted? Is that how people have always understood this book? Where did this book come from? Why do we have these books? Once all of those things start to kind of come into view and you start to ask those questions, then the basic hermeneutic, the basic lens through which people view Protestant Christianity really falls apart very quickly, I think. And so I've met numerous people for whom that was a major shift in how they started to understand Christianity. And another variation of that argument may be, in fact, I'm getting this from Martin Luther, who shared that one of the scruples he'd struggled with, which wasn't a scruple, was just the opinion of conscience, was, are you alone wise? The idea being, is it really possible that no one understood Christianity before the Reformation? And Luther bizarrely sort of says, yeah. He compares himself to Noah and compares the church fathers to the wicked generation Noah was in. And the arrogance of this is really kind of staggering. Because, yeah, I mean, if you view yourself as Noah, where you're the only just man on earth, yep, fine. But most people don't have the hubris to kind of go that way. And you can challenge it really simply because saying, okay, so what about if somebody comes along tomorrow and says, no, it wasn't just the first 1,500 years, it was the first 2,000 years. And everybody for the first 2,000 years was wrong. So here's this new form of Christianity no one's ever heard of. Most people have enough of a gut sense and enough common sense to just say, yeah, that doesn't sound right. That's not how Jesus intends Christianity to work. Because at a certain point, you have to think Jesus is a pretty lousy teacher to think he taught something nobody ever understood.
Yeah. Yeah, that's amazing. Here's a book title for you, so you can take this one for free. And I'm ripping it off of a meme. So, but
We're off to a good start.
everyone is wrong but me.
Yes.
Understanding the mind of Martin Luther.
Yeah. I get the. I mean, there is a book called "Are You Alone Wise," which is taking that, which is basically the flip side to the everyone is wrong but me.
Yeah. Okay. So Haley's got another question. So do you like to debate? I don't think I've actually ever seen you in a debate.
I don't do a lot of. Yeah, I need to do more debates. I think I want to leave enough time to really prepare for a debate.
Okay.
And so in some ways I'm building towards that, where I'm kind of just like I'm just starting the video version of the blog, or the podcast. And I don't know. I think if the right kind of context comes along, I'd be really happy to debate. I mean, I was a debater for 8 years. I was a litigator. So in that sense, I think it's something I would be remiss not to do. I just haven't kind of jumped in too quickly.
Gotcha. Okay.
I've done one. Actually, Peter D. Williams and I did a debate on Sola Scriptura that I was pleased with, but it was too long format-wise. So I'm still learning how to do it well in terms of just those kind of questions, like format, the breadth of topic, all that stuff.
Yeah. Is that debate that you did, is that publicly available somewhere?
Oh yeah, it is. I'm totally blanking on. I can visualize all three of the other people who are involved. I feel really bad if they're listening, which they probably aren't. But yeah, you can find this. If you look up Joe Heschmeyer and Peter D. Williams, you'll probably find it.
Gotcha.
Here,
okay.
Look it up right now. I know it's poor form, but
yeah, no, you can do that. Drop it in the private chat, and I'll add it to the description if I remember.
Okay. Oh yeah, it's on Gospel Truth, and it was with Jeremiah Nordier and Merrick Kaiser. And so yeah, let me.
Okay.
Yeah, let me send it to you right now.
Okay, cool. Sweet. Yeah, let me add that to the description. So while I am doing that, I guess she said, or do you want to debate Allie Beth Stuckey? And I don't know.
So I have not seen this Allie Beth Stuckey thing. I saw the preview pane for it, and so apparently she debates somebody on
George Farmer.
Oh, okay, yeah, on whether to be Catholic or Protestant, because oh gosh, her name just slipped my mind as well.
Candace
famous.
Owens.
Thank you. Candace Owens' husband is Catholic.
Trent and I have been talking about this.
Okay, yeah. So. Well, short answer, if she has interesting arguments, or if she's really prominent and has bad arguments, that's fine too. I'd be happy to, with the right kind of context.
Yeah. I think that's one of the things of like, sure, I'd be happy to debate this person, but I don't think that they'd be interested in debating me. Like,
yeah. So. And there's some areas where I think, going back to like tips you'd give aspiring apologists, know the areas you're not great at. A really common mistake people make is going into debates they're not totally ready for because the topic is important, but they're not the right person for it.
Right.
So, in this case with Stuckey, I know Trent has already done stuff responding to her. So that'd be a case where, like, if it came down to me or Trent, I would suggest Trent would be the better choice. But if he was not available and I had time to kind of read up, I'd be happy to do it.
If you were Earth's last hope, you would step up to the plate.
Yes, exactly.
So, okay. Well, now we gotta. So James Lewis here is saying, he's like, love you in Catholic Answers.
I love you too, James.
Listened to you a lot last year while I was working my day job. Now, and that just kind of sparked a question in my mind. So you do Catholic Answers live a lot. What was like your favorite question that you've ever gotten? One that just like kind of got you excited?
Oh man. Okay. There's a few. One, almost any question that little kids ask. I did a little kid like hour or 2 hours, and it was amazing. And the questions were so good. And a lot of them were just like really deep and profound. And you just feel really good about doing that. Like, it's a really refreshing, kind of energizing experience. So that's not really a direct answer. It's not a topic, but it's a category. Like any little kid questions about like, why did God let Satan in the Garden of Eden is one I remember. And it's just like, that's a great question. Why did God invent mosquitoes? Those kind of things were just like, oh my gosh, I love these. And now I have a 3-year-old who asks these kind of questions,
Mm-hmm.
and it's a blast and I love it. And I think it makes me a better Christian because it makes me focus on those things that are so big you ignore them. And you're just like, oh yeah, that's good to be reminded of. Like during Holy Week, she kept asking about why did Judas do that? And it was like, yeah, why do we betray God? Because that is such a good question. And I wish it was only him. I wish he was the only one who did that. But I feel like I do that too.
Yeah, it's like Judas betrayed Jesus, but we do it for free.
Right. At least he got some money out of it. Which
Yeah.
that's not the right way to think about it, but I feel that.
Yeah.
Like, what have you gotten out of it? Yeah, it's like, well, yeah, I would betray him for less. So yeah, I think little kid questions are really big ones. Every now and then you'll get someone who you can tell is really close to converting. And those questions where it's kind of like a last obstacle kind of question, those feel really good to be a part of, where
Mm.
that you feel like the ball is really being moved forward. I had one of those recently by email where someone was struggling with purgatory, but you could tell they were on a journey towards the church and getting to explain that. And then he was like, "Oh, this is helpful." That feels really good. Like those kind of things. I mean, it's fun to answer the kind of obscure stuff, the kind of off the wall stuff, but the stuff that you think like this actually matters, like this makes a difference, that's at a whole different level.
Yeah. Okay. So we got a little bit of a more difficult one here. And Eric, forgive me. I do this too. Like I'll type a question. I'll just like skip entire words. So I'm guessing, what is the Catholic answer for the justification of supremacy and not the Orthodox's understanding of primacy from the early church?
Yeah. There's a really good article about this, that honor. So you'll hear that there's a primacy of honor in the West that the Bishop of Rome has. And that's kind of what's described as like the Eastern Orthodox view. But the thing is, historically, honor meant office. And so primacy of honor didn't mean he gets to wear like a fancier hat, he gets to go first in the procession. Primacy of honor in the original sense meant that he actually has a superiority of office. And so once you recognize that, primacy of honor does mean supremacy. Like they're saying the same things, they're just a difference in how it's being expressed. So that would be one answer. Two, we've seen numerous times where this kind of plays out, where Eastern patriarchs and bishops reach out to Rome when there's a doctrinal dispute. That's not the only way of settling a dispute, of course, but that is an important one. And you don't see it going the other way. You don't see the Bishop of Rome saying, Alexandria, we need you to settle this. Constantinople, I need you to settle this. And so it's easy to see kind of the role of the Bishop of Rome in this supreme spot. From extremely early on. Think about the letter of Clement in 96 AD, where Pope Clement is responding to a crisis in the Corinthian church, and he apologizes for delaying in settling their controversy, which he does settle. And they take his letter and they use it liturgically as scripture for decades until they're corrected by the church on this point. But what's striking about this is Clement is the Pope, but the Apostle John is still alive, and Corinth is in the east. So here are these Eastern priests writing to the Bishop of Rome to settle this super early on. I think that's really a very telling kind of event. You find explicit support for this as well in Against Heresies by St. Irenaeus of Lyon. Now, Irenaeus, despite the name, is not from Lyon. He's from Smyrna in the east. He's from the east. Smyrna, a see founded by the Apostle John. He probably trains in Rome, and then he becomes a bishop in France. And it wasn't actually called Lyon at the time, by the way, but that's neither here nor there. It's not called Lyon. Anyway, he writes about this in Against Heresies, where he talks about the necessity of all Christians to agree with the Church of Rome. That seems like a pretty clear affirmation in the year 180 of papal supremacy. Now, to give it context, 181 is the first time we see the word Trinity used. And so if you only had resources from 180 or before, you would have an easier time proving that the Bishop of Rome is supreme than you would proving that the Trinity is what Christians believe in. That tells you something about the structure of the early church. And I didn't even mention here, by the way, Ignatius of Antioch, who in his letter to the Romans refers to them as presiding in charity. Well, presiding over what? Presiding over the church. That this leadership in love. This is the Christian model of leadership. Go back to Luke 22, that Jesus talks about servant leadership being the model. I'm among you as one who serves. That's the model of leadership. And immediately after presenting this model of leadership to the 12, he then highlights one of them, St. Peter, and tells him, strengthen your brethren. So he's the servant leader of the servant leaders.
Wow, that's fantastic. And also, I was just kind of marveling, just like, dang, I'm listening to you just like give this answer right off the cuff. It's like, man, I got a long way to go.
So, it didn't happen overnight. You did ask the same question enough, and you start to remember things that you had last time. And so I think if you were to make a supercut of every time I'd been asked a variation of that question, you'd see it slowly having more details, where I was able to recall things a little quicker each time, and you remember certain things and you don't go for certain things because it's too long or whatever. So, don't sweat it.
Yeah. So here's a question from Chris Easley, who's a remarkably cool dude. So as an apologist who focuses on the intellectual side of the faith for a living, do you ever feel spiritual fatigue? If so, how do you balance reason and spiritual life?
Yeah, early on when I had the Shameless Popery blog, I had a moment where I realized I was skipping daily mass because I was working on a blog post I didn't want to let go of. And I thought, oh, that's not good. That's not where I want to be. And so I think the first kind of correction to that was just to really try to make prayer and mass very central, structured pattern part of the day and in the week. That if you're not doing that, you will run out of steam very quickly. And I've seen this happen. I've seen people kind of peter out or go off the rails. And I think it almost invariably comes with something going wrong in the prayer life first. So that, I think you cannot overstate the importance of that. No one will know whether you're doing it or not, but God knows, and it'll show up in your work. So I would say, put that very much in kind of pride of place.
Gotcha. Yeah, no, this isn't a gossip show, so we're not going to name names, but like, I've seen some very smart, very intelligent people seemingly go off the rails, and it's kind of scary to me as somebody who's like very early on to this, is like, geez, could that be me like one of these days?
Yeah, there was a span of a few years where it seemed like all the major celebrity priests just kind of had some major scandal, and then the YouTube personalities came next, and it was just like, man, it's something to watch out for, because you're inviting spiritual attack, and you're inviting greater judgment in a way that you'll be held to a higher standard if you hold yourself out as a Catholic authority. And so that's something to take extremely seriously. That is a spiritual undertaking, and if you're not being nourished and supported, you got to watch out for that. I think a couple other things. Having a good network of people spiritually is super important. I mean, that's true whether you're an apologist or just an aspiring saint. I love, I believe it's January 3rd. It's the feast of Basil and Gregory. And the Office of Readings for that day is Basil talking about Gregory, or maybe the other way around. But it's just about their friendship and how they saw in one another a standard of holiness for which to strive. And that is something that's really spoken to me. At the time, a very good friend of mine, now Father Irenaeus Dunlevy, he and I were just like, we recognized ourselves in that description. And so many years on January 3rd, I'll reach out to him and just shoot him a message or something. But just, you need that. And I've got that here in Kansas City as well. I've got people I can text, and they can text me and just say, hey, pray for me. I'm down, or I'm struggling with this, or whatever it is.
Yeah.
And it's so helpful. And it's just people who can run the race with you, or just can call you to more. This was something that was great about seminary. I remember a friend of mine, Alan Winters from the Diocese of Wichita, came up to my room one day and just said, hey, can I talk to you? And he said, you get to mass like 2 minutes beforehand, and I'd like to encourage you to like make more time. And it was that was convicting. I'm late to everything. And so I would, make it on time, but it was just barely. And so I wasn't as spiritually recollected as I should have been. Having people around you who can kind of call you on that, who don't just see the public persona, but can really say, okay, I see you, and I see where you need to grow.
Yeah. So I got a little bit. This is a kind of a very hyper specific question. So take a crack at it if you feel like it.
Okay.
But why do you think Justin Martyr quotes the Gospels without referring to them with their modern titles? Is that evidence for pseudonymity? Yeah.
I don't think it is. He refers to the Memoirs of the Apostles just by that title. So, in the two contexts we have his writings, you've got First Apology, where he's writing to the Roman Emperor, and you've got his dialogue with Trypho, who is writing to a Jewish audience. In neither of those worlds does it make much sense to be referring to Mark and Luke at a time when no one's really heard of Mark or Luke. He refers to Mark's gospel at one point as a memoir of Peter, which I don't think we should take to mean that Peter actually wrote it, but is just the traditional view that Mark is the interpreter of Peter, and that what we read in the Gospel of Mark really is a recounting of what Peter taught. And so you actually have one point kind of in favor of the traditional authorship there, if you understand that correctly. That calling it the memoir of Peter makes sense if Markan authorship is correct. The Moratorian fragment, which is from the middle part, or like right at the same time as Justin Martyr, includes it's a fragment. So we don't actually have Matthew and Mark, but it says the third gospel is Luke and the fourth is John. And reasonably, we can guess that the first two are Matthew and Mark. So yeah, there are those kind of piecemeal references. The first person to mention all four of them clearly is Irenaeus in 180.
Wow. Okay. I got to say, I'm quite impressed that you just had that just right off the cuff.
That is literally a chapter in early church was the Catholic Church. So that was home turf in that sense.
Okay. All right. I definitely need to pick that one up. So, okay. So Eric's back and he's asking, what is the difference between the conversation with an Orthodox on the papacy versus a Protestant?
Okay. Those two are both big umbrellas. So there's not just like one easy or clear bright line. If I had to give a one sentence answer, I would say the Orthodox conversation often gets mired in historical minutia from the first 1,000 years. It'll say, and this local council or this saint that is in Turkey said this, and that becomes much more. Whereas the Protestant case is almost always, well, what does the Bible have to say? And so it's a cleaner argument in a lot of ways. When you're talking about the Orthodox, I would say you broadly have two categories. You've got the ethnic Orthodox, these are people who, Serbian, Russian, Turkish, whatever, who oftentimes are coming at this through a lens of a lot of other stuff that's happened in just East-West relations. I was in Serbia, and this is not a humble brag. I was in Serbia having tea with the Archbishop, and we asked him for the history of his diocese. And he begins with the division of the Roman Empire in 476. And I thought, we're going to be here a while. And I'm like trying to keep up because this is all in Italian, and my Italian is terrible. And he tells this funny story about in the 90s when the U.S. bombs Serbia because of the war.
Right.
That some of the people asked him, why is Pope John Paul II bombing us? And they had just failed to distinguish between JP2 and Bill Clinton. And it was a remarkable kind of revealing thing that when you're talking about ethnic Orthodox, especially ordinary people, there is often a lot of ethnic and national stuff that plays in a way that's really confusing and complicated. Because on the major theological stuff, it's minute. Like, you can't convince me that ordinary Orthodox and Catholics even understand what the difference in procession theology even means with the Filioque. That's not why people aren't united. Give me a break. There's a handful of theologians who understand that stuff and care about it. That is not why we're not united.
Yeah.
And it's not why the Council of Ephesus was rejected. Or the Council, not Ephesus, Florence, the Council of Florence in the 1450s was rejected. The Mark of Ephesus is one of the major players in rejecting it. So I said Ephesus. That's just not where it is. And then the other major group of Orthodox you've got are the convert Orthodox, who are often like Protestants who realized that Protestantism didn't work, but had a strong reason to not become Catholic. And there's often among those kind of convert Orthodox sort of an anti-Catholic bent that's just them carrying over their anti-Catholicism from Protestantism,
Yeah.
and now they've got better liturgy. And so that would be like those two are barely the same church. They might go to the same divine liturgy, but their theology isn't the same. Their vision of the world isn't the same. And so the conversation you're going to have with them is a world apart. That's orthodoxy. Protestantism is 1,000 times more complicated.
Yeah. Yeah, it's like depends on who you talk. Are you talking to a fundamentalist Baptist or you?
Right, an Anglo-Catholic. Like there's a gamut there that
Yeah.
is as wide as you could possibly imagine.
Yeah. Yeah. Okay. Well, cool. Oh man, I had a couple other questions, but they are slipping my mind right now. But is there anything that you would like to plug? Anything you got going on right now that you want everybody to know
Oh,
about?
sure. I kind of mentioned this already, but there is an audio and a video form of Shameless Potpourri. Shamelessjoe.com is the audio, like the way to get to the audio. You can also get it on Spotify, Apple Music, or wherever. And then over on YouTube, if you just type in Shameless Potpourri, you should be able to find it pretty easily.
Nice. Yeah. No, it's funny because like I was just like, this is going to be the last chance that I have to have a bigger channel than a Catholic Answers apologist because I think by the end of the week, you're going to pass me.
Yeah, so we're up to 25 episodes on the audio side and
Uh-huh.
maybe half that on the video side, but it is weekly now, and so it's growing. It's it's getting there. But yeah, I'm
Yeah.
impressed with what you got going here. So hopefully
Yeah.
we can have a race and we'll both do well.
Please, it's not going to be a race. It's going to be a beat down at the end of the week. But hey, but no, like yeah. So for real, like if y'all are watching, you're not subscribed, go over there. Like it's really educational. You could, Joe's got a really nice way of speaking. But it's kind of funny. So Avoiding Babylon has like these trivia nights or whatever, and one of these guys said like, I don't know, Rob sounds a lot like Joe Heschmeyer. And then I'm the discount Jimmy Aiken, so it's kind of funny that
I wouldn't have made that connection until you said it, but man, that is a great description.
yeah so this is
That's a good compliment. I mean,
yeah
Discount
well,
Jimmy Aiken is still doing good.
it's so funny because like every time this is like Walmart brand, Dollar General brand, Family Dollar brand, whatever, but if they say like Costco brand, I'm like whoa, you need to dial it back a little bit. That's too much of an insult to the Kirkland name. So, but yeah, well, hey, so well, anyway, y'all, thanks for tuning in. And then you said you got a book coming out in July, right?
Yeah, I do, and I'm starting the very earliest stages of working on another book, possibly, but I won't even mention that one because it's too early. But
Not,
yeah,
not gonna mention it as I mention it.
yeah, exactly. And I think the title of it is going to be "The Eucharist is Really Jesus," the one coming out in July. And
Ooh,
so,
okay.
yeah, keep an eye out for it.
Is this going to be like a sequel to Jesus and the Jewish Church of the Eucharist by Brant Petrie?
I know won't be a sequel, but it'll be spiritually indebted to that book in some ways.
Oh, nice. Okay. Well, y'all, thanks for tuning in. This was great. And, it's